The rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the dimly lit kitchen offered a deceptive sense of domestic peace, hiding the fractures bleeding beneath the surface of a 7-year marriage. But tucked inside the junk drawer, hidden beneath takeout menus and unpaid gas bills, lay a manila folder holding a drafted divorce petition and a receipt for a retainer fee paid from a joint savings account. It is in these suffocatingly quiet moments that the most devastating betrayals are brought to light, not with a scream, but with a whisper of paper. If the delicate, dangerous unraveling of secrets and the heavy cost of broken vows draw you in, stay with me. There are far more shadows behind these closed doors, and if you want to walk through the wreckage with them, don't leave the channel just yet. The rhythmic, metallic rattle of the L train shaking the living room windows had been the soundtrack to Samir Hassan's mornings for 7 years. It was 4:15 a.m. in Chicago. Outside, the city was a bruised purple, heavy with the damp chill of late autumn. Inside their cramped first-floor apartment, the air was thick with the smell of stale cooking oil and the faint, floral scent of Carmen's cheap perfume. Samir sat on the edge of a worn armchair, tightening the laces of his steel-toed boots. His shoulders ached with the preemptive exhaustion of a 12-hour shift at the logistics center. Through the thin walls of the bedroom, he could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of his wife. Carmen had come home past midnight, smelling of diner grease, spilled coffee, and a faint hint of peppermint that he hadn't thought to question until now. And standing up, Samir padded quietly into the narrow kitchen. The bulb in his heavy-duty flashlight had burned out the day before, and navigating the dark warehouse lots required it. He pulled open the junk drawer beside the stove, a tangled mess of takeout menus, rubber bands, and past-due utility bills they constantly juggled. He pushed aside a stack of grocery store receipts, his rough, calloused fingers searching for a spare pack of batteries. Instead, his hand brushed against the stiff edge of a heavy manila envelope. Samir frowned. It was tucked flat against the bottom, deliberately hidden beneath a layer of coupons. He pulled it out, the thick paper feeling heavy in his palm. The fluorescent light over the sink flickered, casting long, bruised shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. He opened the flap. Petitioner, Carmen Delgado Hassan. Respondent, Samir Hassan. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The air in Samir's lungs instantly evaporated. He stared at the bold, sterile typography, the legal jargon swimming before his eyes. Attached to the back was a receipt from a downtown law firm. $2,000, the exact amount Carmen had told him she needed to withdraw from their emergency fund 2 weeks ago to help her mother cover emergency dental surgery. A cold, hollow void opened in Samir's chest. It wasn't the sharp, fiery burn of anger. It was a slow, agonizing descent into freezing water. He leaned his weight against the chipped Formica counter, his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. She was leaving him. Not just leaving him, she was quietly dismantling their life, funding her escape with the very overtime hours he had worked until his back gave out. Then, the kitchen counter vibrated. Carmen's phone, left carelessly on the edge of the sink to charge, lit up. The harsh blue light illuminated a single notification on the lock screen. Greg Miller. Can't stop thinking about you in that apron. Let me know when you drop the dead weight, baby. Miss you. Samir stared at the screen until it went dark again. Greg Miller, the regional manager from the auto lot down the street from the diner, the man with the least luxury car and the loud laugh who always tipped too well. The pieces clicked together with a sickening, mechanical precision. Samir didn't throw the phone. He didn't storm into the bedroom and drag her out of sleep. He simply stood there in the silent, oppressive kitchen, listening to the distant wail of a siren echoing down the avenue. The woman sleeping in the next room was no longer his wife. She was an architect of his ruin. Very carefully, Samir slid the papers back into the envelope. He placed the envelope exactly where he had found it, smoothing the takeout menus over it, leaving no trace of his discovery. He zipped up his heavy canvas jacket, the cold reality of his new existence settling into his bones. The neon sign of Rosa's All-Day Diner buzzed with a low, electrical hum, bleeding harsh red light onto the wet Chicago pavement. Inside, the dinner rush was a cacophony of clattering silverware, sizzling flat-top grills, and the tired chatter of the neighborhood's working class. Samir pushed through the heavy glass doors, the bell overhead announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place in his hollowed-out chest. He didn't walk to his usual booth near the back. Instead, He slid onto a cracked vinyl stool at the far end of the counter, partially obscured by a rotating pie display. He ordered a black coffee from a teenage busboy, keeping the brim of his faded canvas cap pulled low. Then, he watched his wife. Carmen was a blur of motion in her maroon apron, balancing 3 plates of meatloaf on one arm while seamlessly refilling a regular's coffee mug with the other. To anyone else, she was the picture of a hard-working, exhausted woman pushing through another brutal shift. But Samir was no longer looking at her through the lens of a husband. He was looking at a stranger. He studied the way she smiled, the practiced, tired curve of her lips that he had kissed 1,000 times, now wondering how much of their life together had been a carefully rehearsed performance. It didn't take long for the focal point of her performance to arrive. The bell jingled again, and Greg Miller walked in. He looked exactly like the kind of man who sold overpriced sedans with predatory interest rates. Sharp suit slightly too tight at the shoulders, heavily gelled hair, and a confident, easy swagger that commanded the room. He didn't wait to be seated. He bypassed the host stand and slid into a corner booth, owning the space. From his vantage point, Samir watched the immediate, subtle shift in Carmen's posture. The exhaustion seemed to temporarily drain from her shoulders. She smoothed down the front of her apron, her hand lingering near her collarbone before she grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and made a beeline for the corner booth. Samir wrapped his calloused hands around his thick ceramic mug, the heat searing his palms, grounding him. He needed the physical pain to tether his mind. He watched as Carmen leaned in to pour Greg's coffee. It wasn't a professional distance. Her hip brushed against the edge of the table, and she lingered there a fraction of a second too long. Greg looked up at her, not at her face, but at the open collar of her uniform, a slow, familiar smirk spreading across his face. He said something low, inaudible over the diner's din, and Carmen laughed. It wasn't her polite customer service laugh. It was a soft, breathless sound, a sound Samir hadn't heard in their cramped apartment in over 2 years. Underneath the table, hidden from the rest of the diner, but visible in the reflection of the stainless steel napkin dispenser, Greg's hand rested on Carmen's thigh. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it. The air in Samir's lungs turned to glass. Every instinct, forged by pride and love, screamed at him to cross the linoleum floor, to flip the heavy laminate table, to drag Greg out by his tailored collar. He wanted to shatter the easy, arrogant smile on the man's face. He wanted to demand Carmen look him in the eye and explain the $2,000, the manila envelope, the 7 years of history she was preparing to incinerate. But he didn't move. He sat perfectly still, the bitter taste of cheap coffee burning his throat. Confronting them now would only satisfy his ego for a fleeting minute. It would give Carmen the excuse to play the victim, to execute her exit strategy with the upper hand, leaving him with nothing but his pride and a drained bank account. He placed a crumpled $5 bill on the counter, leaving his coffee half-finished. He had seen enough. The illusion of his marriage was dead, replaced by the cold, calculating clarity of survival. Samir stood up, blending into the tired crowd, and walked out into the freezing city night. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be a heartbroken husband. Tomorrow, he would be the architect of her consequence. The break room of the Apex Logistics Center smelled perpetually of burnt coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the stale sweat of 50 exhausted men. Overhead, a single fluorescent tube buzzed like a dying insect, casting a sickly pale light over the scuffed linoleum tables. Samir sat alone in the far corner, his safety vest draped over the back of a plastic chair. The low roar of forklifts and hydraulic presses bled through the cinder block walls, a mechanical symphony that usually brought him a dull sense of peace. Today, it sounded like a countdown. He wiped a smudge of grease from his thumb with a coarse paper towel before unlocking his phone. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate heavy machinery, trembled slightly as he opened the banking app for their joint savings account. He hadn't looked at the detailed transaction history in months. He had trusted her. When you work 60 hours a week hauling pallets, you rely on the person at home to hold the center. Carmen had always managed the bills. The screen loaded, illuminating his face in the dim room. Samir began scrolling back. August 12th. Withdrawal. $450. He remembered that one. The Honda's alternator, she had said, looking stressed at the kitchen table. He had worked a double shift that weekend to make up for the hit to their emergency fund. September 3rd. Withdrawal, $600. Her mother's root canal. Carmen had cried that night, burying her face in his chest, whispering how guilty she felt, taking their savings for her family. He had stroked her hair and told her it was only money. October 18th. Withdrawal, $950. Samir's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that drew a brief glance from a coworker across the room. He stared at the glowing numbers. $2,000 in total, carefully extracted over 3 months in increments, just small enough not to trigger panic. The exact amount on the retainer receipt he had found in the manila envelope. There was no broken alternator. There was no dental emergency. Every tear she had shed, every worried sigh over their finances, had been a calculated performance designed to siphon the blood and sweat directly from his veins. The betrayal metastasized, transforming from the visceral sting of her infidelity into something far more terrifying. She wasn't just leaving him for the smooth-talking manager at the auto lot. She was meticulously stripping him down, ensuring that when she finally dropped the legal papers on the dining table, he would be too financially crippled to fight back. She was building a comfortable nest for her new life, using the bricks he was carrying on his broken back. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over him, isolating him entirely from the industrial noise of the warehouse. He looked down at his boots, scuffed, steel-toed, the leather worn thin at the creases. He had delayed buying a new pair since last winter to keep their savings padded. Samir closed the app, the screen going black. The crushing weight of grief that had paralyzed him the night before began to crystallize into something else. It was cold, sharp, and perfectly clear. He slipped the phone back into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't weep. Instead, a chilling stillness washed over him. The woman he loved had died in his mind the moment he saw Greg Miller's hand on her thigh. The woman he was dealing with now was an adversary. And in the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of survival, the one who strikes first dictates the end. The November wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal, cutting through Samir's canvas jacket as he walked the 3 blocks from the warehouse to the local credit union. It was his 30-minute lunch break. Normally, he would spend this time sitting on a loading dock, eating the turkey sandwich Carmen had packed for him the night before, mindlessly scrolling through sports highlights on his phone. Today, the sandwich sat untouched in his locker. He had a different kind of hunger now. Inside the bank, the fluorescent lighting felt overly sterile, illuminating the exhausted lines on the faces of the working-class patrons waiting in the queue. Samir stood perfectly still, clutching his faded leather wallet. When the teller, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Chloe, called him forward, his voice didn't waver. "I need to open a checking account," Samir said, his tone flat and businesslike. "Individual. And I need to transfer my direct deposit from my current joint account starting this Friday." Chloe typed methodically, the clacking of her keyboard echoing in the quiet lobby. "Of course, Mr. Hassan. I just need your ID and an initial deposit." Samir handed over his driver's license and a crumpled $100 bill, his personal cash stash from picking up extra weekend shifts, hauling heavy equipment. It wasn't much, but it was an anchor. As the teller printed the temporary debit card and the new routing numbers, Samir stared at his own name, printed alone on the stark white paper. Samir Hassan. No. And Carmen Delgado Hassan. The visual separation was a punch to the gut, making the impending death of his marriage terribly real. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his breast pocket alongside his phone. One tether cut. He didn't return to the warehouse immediately. He used the remaining 15 minutes of his break to walk to a nondescript brick building 2 streets over. The frosted glass door read, "Downtown Legal Aid Clinic." The waiting room smelled of old paper and nervous sweat. Samir was ushered into a cramped office, where a frazzled attorney named Marcus, wearing a loosened tie and a suit that had seen better days, sat behind a desk completely buried in case files. Samir didn't waste time on pleasantries. He laid out the facts with the clinical precision of a man detailing a broken hydraulic press, the hidden manila folder, the $2,000 retainer paid from their joint emergency fund, the text message from Greg Miller. Marcus stopped clicking his pen and looked up, properly assessing the man sitting across from him. "In Illinois, marital assets are generally divided equitably," Marcus explained, his voice low and practiced. But if you can prove dissipation of marital funds, meaning she spent joint money for a purpose unrelated to the marriage, like a secret divorce retainer or funding an affair, we can ask the judge to credit you that amount in the final division. But you need to act fast before she drains whatever is left. I just secured my future paychecks, Samir said quietly, but there's still exactly $3,000 left in the joint savings. Take half, Marcus advised without hesitation. Legally, it's 50% yours. Move it to your new account today. Let her explain to her expensive downtown lawyer why she tried to hide the rest under the guise of fake medical bills. We file our petition tomorrow morning. We serve her before she even knows you've found her stash. Samir looked at the cheap plastic clock ticking on the attorney's wall. His lunch break was over. He had to go back to moving pallets, sweating for a life that no longer existed. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. "Draft it," Samir said, his voice devoid of the warmth that had defined him for 7 years. "I'll transfer the money during my afternoon break." Walking back to the logistics center, the freezing wind didn't bother him anymore. The numbness had become a shield. He pulled out his phone, navigating back to the joint banking app. With a few deliberate taps, he transferred exactly $1,500 into his new, isolated account. He left the remaining balance for her. It was enough to show the court he was playing by the rules, but not enough for her to finish buying her freedom with his money. The trap was set, and for the first time since he found that envelope, Samir felt entirely in control. Sunday morning sunlight filtered weakly through the dusty horizontal blinds of the apartment, casting pale, striped shadows across the living room floor. The smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee, a scent that had defined the rare, peaceful weekends of their 7-year marriage, now turned Samir's stomach into a tight, heavy knot. He stood perfectly still in the shadowy hallway, watching his wife through the kitchen doorway. Carmen was wearing one of his old, faded flannel shirts, her dark hair pulled up into a careless, messy bun. She hummed softly along to a Spanish pop ballad playing faintly from the small countertop radio, swaying her hips slightly as she flipped eggs in the skillet. To any outside observer, it was a flawless portrait of working-class domestic tranquility, a hard-working woman preparing a warm meal for her exhausted husband. But Samir knew the truth. He knew she had been with Greg Miller the night before. She had claimed she was covering a late-night double shift at the diner, but when she had slipped into bed at 2 in the morning, she hadn't smelled of industrial sanitizer or fryer grease. She had smelled of expensive, masculine cologne and cheap wine. Samir closed his eyes, forcing his shoulders to drop, burying the visceral revulsion deep in his chest. He had to play the game. The legal petition was drafted. Marcus was filing it the moment the courthouse opened on Monday morning, and the money had already been moved. Until then, Samir had to be the weary, trusting husband. "Morning," he rasped, stepping into the kitchen and keeping his voice thick with fake sleep. Carmen turned, flashing him a bright, practiced smile. "Morning, mi amor. Sit down. I'm almost done." Samir pulled out a chair at the wobbly wooden dining table. He watched her plate the food, her movements fluid and familiar. She set the warm plate in front of him, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his temple. He didn't flinch, though every muscle in his jaw locked tight. Her lips felt like dry ice against his skin. "You worked so hard this week," Carmen murmured, taking the seat across from him and wrapping her hands around her steaming coffee mug. "I thought you deserved a real breakfast, not just toast and diner leftovers." "Thanks," Samir mumbled around a mouthful of eggs. They tasted like ash. For a few minutes, the only sound was the scraping of silverware and the low murmur of the radio. The silence between them, which used to be a comfortable refuge from the noisy city, was now a minefield. Samir casually studied the faint, dark circles under her eyes. She was exhausted, too. Living a double life, juggling a secret lover, a clueless husband, and a calculated financial plot was taking its toll. "Hey," Carmen said softly, tracing the ceramic rim of her mug with a manicured fingernail. "I talked to my mom yesterday. Here it comes," Samir thought, a cold clarity washing over him. The final act. "Yeah? How is she doing?" he asked, keeping his eyes fixed on his plate. "Her recovery from the dental surgery is... It's going okay, but the dentist says she needs a follow-up procedure for a minor infection." Carmen lied smoothly, her voice laced with the exact, perfect amount of daughterly distress. "It might be another $500. I know things are incredibly tight right now, but I was thinking we could pull it from the savings. Just this last time, I promise. Samir slowly looked up at her. Her brown eyes were wide, pleading, filled with a manufactured vulnerability that made him sick to his core. She was trying to drain the last remaining funds to finish paying off her divorce lawyer before she dropped the papers on him. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of his throat. "Yeah, of course," Samir said, his voice completely level. "Family comes first. You do what you need to do." Carmen let out a long, trembling sigh of relief, reaching across the small table to affectionately squeeze his hand. "Thank you, Samir. You're such a good man. I'll go to the bank on Monday afternoon." "Monday," Samir agreed quietly, his calloused thumb lightly brushing the back of her hand, before pulling away to pick up his fork. "Sounds like a plan." He turned his gaze to the window, watching the distant L train rattle across the overpass. By the time she walked into that bank lobby on Monday, there would be no money left to steal, and a process server would be waiting for her at the diner. The illusion was almost over. The bay doors of the Apex Logistics Center were wide open, letting in the biting afternoon chill and the heavy scent of diesel exhaust. Samir stood on the concrete loading dock, a clipboard in his gloved hand, scanning barcodes on a towering pallet of automotive parts. His breath plumed in the freezing air. It was Monday, 3 p.m. Across the city, Carmen would be walking into the credit union right about now. The thought brought a strange, hollow calmness to his chest. An idling box truck hissed as its air brakes engaged, and the driver hopped down from the cab. It was Hector, a veteran route driver who ran freight for half the industrial parks and dealerships on the south side. "Cold enough for you, Hassan?" Hector called out, tossing a stack of invoices onto the metal folding table. "Getting there," Samir replied, stamping his steel-toed boots on the concrete to keep the circulation moving. "You look like you're running late," Hector groaned, leaning against the corrugated metal wall. "Don't get me started. Had a drop-off at that shiny auto plaza down on 4th Street. Total nightmare. Those guys in the cheap suits think they run the world, but they can't even sign a manifest on time." Samir paused, his pen hovering over a barcode. The auto plaza on 4th Street. It was exactly 2 blocks from Rosa's all-day diner. "Yeah?" Samir kept his voice entirely casual, his eyes fixed firmly on his clipboard. "I know the place. You ever deal with a manager over there? Guy named Greg Miller?" Hector let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed across the empty loading bay. "Miller? Oh, you mean the $50,000 millionaire?" Samir finally looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Meaning what?" "Meaning the guy is a walking credit score disaster," Hector said, pulling off his heavy work gloves to blow warm air into his hands. "He acts like he owns the lot, but he's just a regional floor manager. My cousin runs the repo lot out in Cicero. Says Miller has had 2 cars repossessed in the last 3 years. That fancy sedan he drives, a corporate lease he's 3 months behind on. The guy owes money to his tailor, his bookie, and probably his own mother." The cold wind whipping off the tarmac suddenly felt entirely absent to Samir. He stood motionless, absorbing the words. "Yeah," Hector continued, oblivious to the seismic shift happening in Samir's mind. "He's one of those guys who hangs around local diners and dive bars, flashing cash he pulled from a high-interest credit card just to impress the waitresses. Makes him feel like a big shot because he can't cut it with the women in his own tax bracket. Total clown." Hector grabbed his signed invoices, clapped Samir on the shoulder, and climbed back into his cab. The heavy truck rumbled away, leaving Samir alone on the freezing dock. Samir lowered the clipboard. A profound, almost suffocating silence settled over him. All weekend, beneath his cold anger, there had been a lingering, toxic seed of inadequacy. He had imagined Greg Miller as the ultimate upgrade, a man who could offer Carmen the stability, the luxury, and the effortless life that Samir, with his calloused hands and 12-hour warehouse shifts, never could. But Greg wasn't an escape route. He was a mirage. Carmen was risking everything, her marriage, her reputation, her entire financial foundation, for a man drowning in debt. She thought she was being calculating and ruthless by stealing their emergency fund to secure her exit, believing Greg would catch her on the other side. But Greg was only interested in her because she was desperate, easy prey to stroke his fragile ego. The moment he found out she was coming to him with nothing but legal fees and empty pockets, the illusion would shatter. Samir looked at the digital clock on the warehouse wall. 3:15 p.m. She was at the teller window now. She was handing over her debit card, fabricating a story about her mother's dental surgery, asking for the remaining $1,500. She was completely unaware that she had already lost everything. Samir didn't feel rage anymore. Looking out over the bleak, gray expanse of the industrial park, he felt only a cold, devastating pity. The house of cards was about to collapse, and he was no longer standing inside it. The fluorescent lights of the Cook County Courthouse hummed with a low, institutional frequency, casting a pale, unforgiving glow over the scuffed marble floors. It was Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Outside, the Chicago rain lashed against the heavy reinforced windows, streaking the glass like tears. But inside, the air was entirely sterile, smelling of floor wax, damp wool, and old paper. Samir Hassan sat on a hard wooden bench in the corridor outside family court, his heavy canvas jacket resting on his knees. He looked down at his hands, calloused, stained with faint traces of engine grease from the warehouse, the silver band still resting on his left ring finger. It felt incredibly heavy now, a hollow symbol of a 7-year lie. Marcus, his legal aid attorney, emerged from the heavy oak doors, adjusting his poorly knotted tie. He held a thin manila folder, a mirrored twin to the one Samir had found hidden in his own kitchen drawer just days ago. "The petition for dissolution of marriage is officially filed," Marcus said, his voice dropping into the hushed, professional register of the courthouse. "Along with the emergency financial injunction, her attorney of record will receive electronic notice within the hour, and the process server is scheduled to visit the diner at the start of her shift this afternoon." Samir didn't smile. There was no victory in this, only the grim necessity of a surgical amputation. "And the accounts?" "Frozen," Marcus confirmed, handing Samir a copy of the stamped filing. "Whatever is left in the joint account cannot be moved, withdrawn, or used to pay her retainer. Your new account is completely isolated. Her access to your direct deposits is severed. She's locked out, Samir." Samir stared at the blue ink of the clerk's stamp. "Received and filed." 3 words that erased nearly a decade of shared dinners, whispered promises in the dark, and grueling overtime shifts worked to build a life that never really existed. He slowly slid the ring off his finger. It didn't stick. It slipped over his knuckle with an ease that felt almost insulting. He dropped the warm metal into the dark depths of his pocket. Across town, the L train rattled over the wet tracks, a metallic screech that echoed down the avenue toward the local credit union. Carmen Delgado stood in the short, winding queue, her wet umbrella dripping quietly onto the tiled floor. She checked her reflection in the glass partition, smoothing down her damp hair. She was exhausted, the double life pulling at her seams, but a flutter of nervous anticipation kept her heart racing. She clutched her debit card tight in her palm. $1,500. The exact remainder she needed to finalize her own retainer. She had rehearsed the lie about her mother's dental infection until it sounded like the absolute truth. Just one more withdrawal, one more perfectly executed performance for her oblivious husband, and she would be free. Greg was supposed to meet her at his apartment later that night to celebrate. "Next in line, please," the teller called out. Carmen stepped forward, offering a warm, practiced smile. She slid the debit card across the smooth laminate counter. "Hi, I need to make a withdrawal from my joint savings account, please." The teller swiped the card, her eyes flicking to the monitor. She typed for a moment, paused, and then typed again, her brow furrowing slightly as a red notification banner illuminated her screen. Back at the courthouse, Samir stood up from the wooden bench. The weight on his shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. He was no longer carrying the crushing burden of another person's deception. He was carrying the stark, clean weight of his own survival. "Take care of yourself, Samir," Marcus said gently, offering a handshake. Samir took the lawyer's hand, his grip firm and steady. "I will. Thank you." He turned and walked down the long, echoing corridor toward the heavy glass exit doors. He didn't look back. He had a shift at the warehouse at noon, and for the first time in 7 years, every drop of sweat he poured onto the concrete floor would belong entirely to him. The young teller behind the thick plexiglass stared at her monitor, the polite customer service smile faltering into a tight line of discomfort. Carmen shifted her weight, the damp fabric of her coat clinging uncomfortably to her shoulders. She checked her watch. 10:14 a.m. She needed to get this money to her lawyer's office before her afternoon shift at the diner. "Is there a problem?" Carmen asked, keeping her tone light, though a cold prickle of anxiety began to crawl up the back of her neck. The teller lowered her voice, glancing nervously around the quiet lobby. "Ma'am, I apologize, but I cannot process this withdrawal. There is a legal hold on this joint account, placed at 9 o'clock this morning. Furthermore, the majority of the balance was transferred out yesterday afternoon into a new, individual account." The polished marble floor seemed to tilt beneath Carmen's boots. The ambient noise of the bank, the hushed conversations, the clicking keyboards, the rustle of paper, faded into a high-pitched ringing in her ears. "Transferred," Carmen breathed, her fingers gripping the edge of the laminate counter until her knuckles turned white. "By who?" "That's our emergency fund." "By the primary account holder, Samir Hassan," the teller replied softly. "You will need to contact him, or whoever placed the court injunction." Carmen didn't take her debit card back. She turned and walked out of the double glass doors, the freezing Chicago rain instantly plastering her hair to her cheeks. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in her mouth. She fumbled for her phone with trembling hands, pulling up the banking app. Access denied. Account frozen. She practically ran the 3 blocks to their apartment building, her chest heaving, the L train roaring overhead, drowning out her erratic thoughts. He couldn't know. How could he know? She had been so careful. She had played the exhausted, loving wife perfectly just yesterday morning over breakfast. Carmen jammed her key into the lock, twisting it so hard the metal groaned. She pushed the door open. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. The faint scent of bleach hung in the air, masking the usual smell of old cooking oil. Standing in the center of the cramped living room, dressed in his heavy canvas warehouse jacket and holding his battered lunch cooler, was Samir. He didn't look angry. He didn't look heartbroken. He looked like he was waiting for a bus. "Samir," Carmen gasped, peeling off her wet coat, her mind scrambling to construct a narrative. A lie. A defense. "The bank. There's something wrong with the bank. They said there's a hold on the account, that you moved the money. We need that for my mother." She stopped. Samir hadn't moved, but his eyes dropped slowly to the small, wobbly dining table. Carmen followed his gaze. Lying dead center on the scratched wood was the heavy manila envelope she had hidden beneath the takeout menus in the kitchen drawer. But it was no longer hidden, and it was no longer her copy. Beside it rested a fresh stack of legal documents, the top page stamped with the bright blue ink of the Cook County clerk, and resting on top of the blue stamp, catching the weak gray light filtering through the blinds, was Samir's silver wedding band. The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed against the walls, heavy and terminal. "You were looking for $1,500, Samir said. His voice was perfectly level, stripped of any warmth, any intimacy, any history. It was the voice of a man speaking to a stranger. "You won't find it." Carmen stared at the ring, her meticulously built house of cards collapsing in an instant. The breath shuddered out of her in a pathetic, broken gasp. "Samir, wait. Let me explain. Please, it's not what you think. I know exactly what it is," he cut her off, stepping toward the front door. "I know about the retainer. I know about the dental bills. I know about Greg Miller." Carmen flinched as if she had been struck. The color completely drained from her face. She reached a hand out toward him, a desperate, instinctive grasp for the man who had always caught her when she fell. Samir didn't even step back. He simply looked at her outstretched hand with mild disgust. "My attorney's card is clipped to the petition," Samir said, pulling open the front door. The damp draft from the hallway swept in, chilling the room. "Don't call my phone again. Don't come to the warehouse. I want you out of this apartment by the end of the week." "Samir, you can't just leave me with nothing," she cried out, the mask of control finally shattering into raw, ugly desperation. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her one last time. "I didn't leave you with nothing, Carmen," he said quietly. "I left you with exactly what you earned." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid heavily into place from the outside, leaving Carmen alone in the crushing silence, with nothing but the rain beating against the glass and the stark blue ink of her own ruin. The elevator ride to the 8th floor of the mid-rise building on the near south side felt interminably slow. Carmen shivered, her damp coat clinging to her shoulders, the Chicago rain still dripping from her hair. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. Greg's apartment was supposed to be her sanctuary. They had talked about this moment for weeks in hushed voices at the diner. The day she would finally be free of the suffocating, paycheck-to-paycheck existence. She just hadn't expected to arrive empty-handed and terrified. When Greg opened the door, he was holding a glass of red wine, wearing a crisp, untucked dress shirt. His easy, arrogant smile was already in place, but it faltered the second he took in her pale face and soaked clothes. "Carmen? What happened? I thought we were meeting at 8. It's gone," she gasped, pushing past him into the apartment. The living room was an exercise in superficial luxury. A sleek leather sofa, a massive flat-screen television, but bare walls, and a distinct lack of personal touches. On the glass coffee table, sitting next to a faux crystal decanter, was a stack of unopened mail with bright red final notice stamps, visible through the window envelopes. Carmen didn't notice them. Her vision was tunneling. "What's gone?" Greg asked, closing the door and keeping a careful distance. He didn't offer to take her wet coat. The money, Samir knew. The words tumbled out of her in a frantic rush. "He found the papers. He filed first, Greg. He drained the joint account yesterday and put a legal freeze on the rest. I couldn't pay my lawyer. I went home, and he had his ring on the table. He told me to get out." She moved toward him, seeking the warm, confident embrace that had fueled her betrayal for months. She needed him to tell her it was going to be okay, that he had her back, that his regional manager salary would cover the retainer and they could finally start their life together. But Greg took a distinct step backward. The movement was small, but in the quiet of the apartment, it was deafening. Carmen froze, her hands hovering in the empty space between them. "Wait, he froze your accounts?" Greg's voice had lost its smooth, practiced cadence. It was tight, pitched a fraction higher. "So you have nothing? What about your savings?" "That was my savings," Carmen pleaded, desperation clawing at her throat. "Greg, I need a place to stay, and I need $1,500 just to keep my attorney on retainer so Samir doesn't wipe me out completely in court. You said you'd take care of me. You said I was dropping dead weight." Greg ran a hand through his heavily gelled hair, avoiding her eyes. The confident swagger evaporated, leaving behind a nervous, cornered man. "Look, Carmen, things are a little complicated right now. Corporate is restructuring my commission tier. My cash flow is completely tied up in investments." He glanced nervously at the stack of past-due bills on the table. For the first time, Carmen followed his gaze. The illusion shattered with a sickening, crystalline clarity. The leased luxury car, the extravagant diner tips paid in cash, the flashy, empty apartment. Greg wasn't an escape route to a better life. He was a drowning man who had only pulled her aboard because he thought she was holding a life preserver. "You don't have the money," Carmen whispered, the reality of her total destruction settling into her bones. "You never did. I told you. It's tied up," Greg snapped, his ego bruised by her sudden realization. His tone turned defensive, shedding any pretense of affection. "And honestly, Carmen, I didn't sign up for a messy, broke divorce. I can't have this kind of drama affecting my career." He walked over to the front door and opened it, letting the cold draft from the hallway sweep back into the room. "I have an early meeting tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "You should probably call a friend." Carmen stood perfectly still. She had no friends left. She had alienated them all to protect her secret. She had no money, no home, and no husband. She walked slowly out into the fluorescent-lit hallway, listening to the heavy door click shut behind her. She had traded 7 years of quiet, steady devotion for a manila envelope and an empty room. The smell of industrial ammonia and burnt coffee at Rose's all-day diner had always been a nuisance to Carmen, a temporary odor she would scrub off in the shower before crawling into bed next to Samir. On Wednesday evening, however, it smelled like a life sentence. She stood behind the counter, her maroon apron stained with a splash of marinara sauce, aggressively wiping down a laminate menu. Her hands were shaking. She had spent the last 2 nights sleeping on the lumpy, flea-bitten sofa in her cousin's cramped apartment in Little Village. Her entire life reduced to a single duffel bag of clothes Samir had allowed her to pack before changing the locks. The diner was packed with the usual dinner rush, but the atmosphere around her felt suffocatingly different. The whispers had started. In a working-class neighborhood, secrets were a luxury no one could afford, and gossip was the only free currency. The process server had walked right up to the host stand 2 days ago, handing her the thick envelope with the blue court stamp in front of Maria, the shift manager, and 3 regular customers. "Hey, Carmen," a raspy voice called out. She flinched, looking up to see Old Man Henderson sliding into his usual booth. He was a retired pipe fitter who always asked about Samir's hours at the warehouse. "Coffee, Mr. Henderson?" Carmen asked, forcing a brittle smile, her voice tight. "Yeah, black. Haven't seen your husband around lately. He pulling doubles again?" the old man asked casually, adjusting his glasses. Carmen's throat closed. The words turned to ash on her tongue. Before she could formulate a lie, she saw Maria shoot her a sharp, knowing look from the cash register. Everyone knew. They knew Greg Miller hadn't shown up for his daily coffee in 3 days. They knew about the court papers. They knew she had played a dangerous, greedy game and lost everything. He's working," Carmen managed to choke out, turning sharply to hide the tears of profound humiliation welling in her eyes. She grabbed the coffee pot, her knuckles white. There was no escape. She was trapped in the very room where she had plotted her grand exit, reduced to scrubbing the tables where Greg used to touch her leg. Across the city, the Apex Logistics Center was a symphony of roaring engines, clanging metal, and the steady, rhythmic thud of heavy boxes hitting wooden pallets. Samir was sweating through his gray thermal shirt, hoisting 60-pound crates of brake pads and stacking them with mechanical precision. The muscles in his back burned, a deep, radiating ache that he welcomed. Physical pain was simple. It had rules. You push a muscle to its limit, it tears, and then it builds back stronger. Hector, the route driver, walked past the loading bay, a lit cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. He paused, watching Samir effortlessly guide a pallet jack into the back of a 50-foot trailer. "You're moving like a machine today, Hassan," Hector called over the roar of a forklift. "Pacing yourself, or trying to break the hourly record?" Samir wiped a mixture of sweat and industrial dust from his forehead with the back of his canvas glove. He looked out past the loading dock, where the Chicago skyline was turning a bruised, dusky purple against the freezing evening air. "Just working, Hector," Samir replied, his voice steady, anchored by a profound, quiet calm. "Just building." He reached into his pocket to check his phone. No unread messages. No fabricated emergencies. No silent betrayals ticking away in the background. For 7 years, he had carried the weight of 2 people, exhausting himself to fund an illusion. Now, every drop of sweat, every ache in his shoulders, and every dollar deposited into his new, isolated account belonged entirely to him. He slid the phone back into his pocket, gripped the heavy metal handles of the pallet jack, and went back to work. The warehouse was cold, brutal, and deafeningly loud, but as Samir took a deep breath of the diesel-tinged air, it was the first time in months he felt truly able to breathe. The radiator in the corner of her cousin's cramped apartment clanked violently, sputtering a weak, metallic hiss of steam that did little to fight off the damp November chill. Carmen sat on the edge of the lumpy, floral-patterned sofa bed, staring blindly at the cracked plaster on the opposite wall. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. Usually at this hour, she would be slipping under the heavy down comforter in her own bedroom, maneuvering carefully so as not to wake Samir, who always managed to leave a pocket of warmth on her side of the mattress. Now, there was only the cold synthetic fabric of a cheap sleeping bag and the suffocating realization of what she had done. Her entire life, 7 years of shared history, quiet compromises, and a flawed but steady partnership, had been reduced to the single, olive-green duffel bag sitting on the stained carpet at her feet. She reached down, unzipping it slowly. Inside were a few uniform aprons, some folded sweaters, and the small, mundane necessities she had hastily shoved inside, while Samir watched her from the hallway, with dead, unblinking eyes just days ago. Her hand brushed against the sleeve of her winter coat. She pulled it onto her lap, her fingers tracing a clumsy, thick line of black thread near the cuff. 2 winters ago, the seam had torn on a nail at the diner. She had cried that night out of sheer frustration over not having the extra $30 to replace it. Samir hadn't said a word. He had simply waited until she fell asleep, found a needle in the junk drawer, and stitched it back together with his rough, calloused hands. It wasn't pretty, but the thick thread held tight. He had always held everything tight. A tear, hot and heavy, spilled over her lashes, and dropped onto the dark wool. She had traded that quiet, steadfast devotion for a man who bought her $15 cocktails but wouldn't even open his door when she was drowning. She had convinced herself that Samir's exhaustion was a lack of ambition, that his worn-out work boots were a symbol of a stagnant, suffocating life. She had craved the cinematic, the thrilling, the effortless. She had believed Greg Miller when he painted a mirage of a life where the bills were always paid and the wine glasses were always full, blinding herself to the desperate reality of his own debt. And worse, she had funded her own destruction. She had looked at the money Samir bled for, the extra shifts hauling heavy machinery until his back seized up, and she had meticulously stolen it to buy her way out of his life. The sheer, grotesque gravity of her greed crushed the breath out of her lungs. The legal reality she now faced was equally as suffocating. Her new counsel, a weary legal aid attorney drowning in caseloads, had been brutally honest. Without the stolen retainer to secure a high-powered lawyer, she was entirely at the mercy of Samir's preemptive filing. The dissipation of marital funds, her calculated theft of their emergency savings, was thoroughly documented. The judge would likely grant Samir every protection he asked for. She wouldn't get a portion of his future warehouse wages. She wouldn't get the apartment. She was walking away with exactly what she had brought to the table when she met him. Nothing. Carmen pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in the thick wool of the mended coat. She wept, the sound muffled by the fabric, her shoulders shaking violently in the dark, unfamiliar room. There was no one to hear her. Her phone, sitting on the dusty coffee table, remained completely dark. No text from Greg, offering a miraculous rescue. No desperate, angry calls from Samir demanding answers. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She had spent the last 6 months meticulously orchestrating an escape from her marriage, fully believing she was the sharpest person in the room, viewing Samir as a simple, predictable obstacle to be circumvented. Only now, sitting in the freezing ruins of her own making, did Carmen Delgado realize she hadn't engineered an escape at all. She had dug a grave, crawled inside, and handed the shovel to the only man who had ever truly loved her. The sun had not yet crested the jagged Chicago skyline, but the deep purple of the night was already bruising into a pale, icy blue. Samir Hassan stood on the narrow wrought-iron balcony of his third-floor apartment in Rogers Park, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The coffee was black, cheap, and scalding, just the way he needed it. Down below, the city was beginning its slow, mechanical crawl toward dawn. A garbage truck groaned down the alleyway, and in the distance, the familiar, metallic screech of the L train cut through the freezing morning air. For 7 years, that sound had been the metronome to a life he thought he understood, a life built on grueling warehouse shifts, shared utility bills, and the quiet, desperate hope of a better tomorrow with a woman who ultimately despised him for it. Now, the train just sounded like a train. Samir took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitter heat ground him. It had been exactly 4 months since the morning he found the manila envelope hidden beneath the takeout menus. The divorce had been finalized with a brutal, bureaucratic efficiency. Carmen had not contested the division of assets, without the stolen retainer to fund a legal war, and with the judge presented with irrefutable evidence of her dissipation of marital funds. The proceedings had been overwhelmingly swift. She was granted nothing from his pension, no claim to his future wages, and was left to absorb the reality of the debts she had accumulated. He hadn't seen her since the rainy afternoon he locked her out of their old apartment. He heard rumors, of course. The warehouse drivers still talked. Hector had mentioned passing her on the street a few weeks ago, bundled in a mended winter coat, waiting for a bus in the biting wind. She was still working at Rose's, taking on extra shifts, completely isolated after Greg Miller evaporated from the neighborhood entirely. Samir felt a hollow pull in his chest at the thought, but it wasn't regret. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was the dull, aching phantom pain of an amputated limb. You survive the surgery, you learn to walk again, but on cold mornings, the scar still burns to remind you of what was lost. He looked down at his left hand. The pale indentation where his silver wedding band used to sit had finally tanned, blending in with the rest of his fingers. The physical evidence of his marriage was gone, erased by time and the harsh winter wind. He had survived the betrayal, not by screaming or breaking down, but by applying the same ruthless, mechanical precision he used to load freight. He had dismantled the trap she set for him and built a lifeboat out of the wreckage. He turned his back to the waking city and stepped inside. The apartment was small, just a single bedroom, a tiny kitchenette, and a living room barely large enough for a sofa and a television. There was no radio playing Spanish pop ballads. There was no smell of old cooking oil or cheap floral perfume. It was silent. It was empty, and it was entirely his. Samir set his mug in the small stainless steel sink. He pulled his heavy canvas jacket off the back of a chair and shrugged it over his shoulders, the familiar weight settling comfortably against his frame. He grabbed his keys from the counter and walked out the door, locking the deadbolt with a solid, definitive click. The air in the hallway was cool and clean. As he descended the stairs to begin his shift, his chest felt incredibly light. For the first time in a very long time, he was carrying nothing but himself.